Welcome to the latest installment of Cooking for Moderately Lazy People. Today, we're going to be making baked pork chops and apples. This will result in sweet pork chops because we're going to bake the pork chops in the same dish as the apples. So if you don't like sweet pork, this might not be the recipe for you. That being said, let's get started. First thing we're going to do is pat some pork chops dry with a paper towel. Then we're going to use a salt grinder and a pepper grinder to season them to taste. Once we've patted in the salt and pepper on the first side, we'll flip them over and repeat the process on the second side. We'll then set the pork aside. Next, we're going to cut up one green onion. We don't want this too coarsely chopped, but it doesn't have to be too fine either. We're mainly using this when we brown the pork. Once that's chopped, it too will be set to the side. We'll then grab 3 red delicious apples. We'll peel them, then cut them into sections. I like to use my apple corer for this, since it makes quick work of getting rid of the core. After that's done, and we've checked to make sure no core or peel is left behind, we then cut the 8 sections from each apple in half. We want to make the sections small enough that they'll fit in the baking dish with the pork chops. Once the apples are chopped, we'll set them aside. They can sit on the counter for now since they won't have much time to start browning, and we're going to bake them anyway. While the apples are being cut, let's talk cost. As usual, your mileage may vary depending on your local prices. The pork chops tend to run about $4 to $5 per pound, so we're looking at, let's say, $10 if you get 2 pounds worth of pork chops. Red Delicious apples usually are less than $1 each, so that's less than $3 for those. A bunch of green onion is about $1, but we're only using one here, so let's call that 15 cents. The cost of the spices and sugar are effectively negligible. In the end, that comes up to around $13 total. That should easily feed a family of 4 for less than $4 per person. But it doesn't scale particularly well because we will pretty much fill up the baking dish. You could do another run with a separate baking dish, just double everything listed, which would likely also double the cost. After we finished with the apples, we're going to put 2 tablespoons of butter in a skillet and turn it on to medium heat to melt the butter. While the butter is melting, we're going to start preheating our oven to 375 degrees. When the butter is melted, we'll then saute the onions in the butter until they've softened up. We will then add the pork and cook it until brown on both sides. While the pork is browning, let's talk sides. Since the pork chops and apples are already going to be sweet with the cinnamon and sugar, we're probably not going to want a second sweet side. I generally go with something like green beans or peas, just to add a different flavor to the meal. You'll notice as I'm flipping the pork over, I'm brushing some of the green onion off of it. We don't need all the onion to stay on it, just a little bit. Once the pork is browned, we'll set it back aside. We're then going to take a 9x13 baking dish and put 2 cups of water in it. In the water, we're then going to add 1/4 cup of brown sugar, 3/4 teaspoon dry mustard, 1/4 teaspoon of cloves, and 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon. We're going to mix the sugar and spices into the water until it's largely dissolved. When that's completed, we're going to start adding our apples to the dish. You'll notice in the video that I actually did this in the wrong order and put the pork chops in first, but you're going to want the pork chops on top of the apples. The reason for that is we want the water over the apples as much as possible. The apples tend to have a better flavor and texture when cooked in the water as opposed to above it. Once we have everything in the baking dish, we're going to cover it with aluminum foil and bake it for 1 hour. We're then going to uncover it very carefully and bake it for another 15 minutes. You'll notice in the video, I wasn't quite careful enough and got slightly scalded. After that 15 minutes, we'll plate the pork chops and put the apples in a bowl for serving. And there you have it, baked pork chops and apples. It's got a longer bake time, so this isn't necessarily something you can just shotgun together on a moment's notice, but it's less than $4 per person to feed a family of 4, and doesn't really take much work apart from coring the apples. As per usual, the recipe is located in the description. If you like the recipe, or the video, please feel free to like, subscribe, comment on, or share the video. As always, thanks for watching, and bon appetit.